How do you respond when people attack you, when they slander your name, when they mock you, when they hate? Well, Taylor Swift says that we should just shake it off. The book of Nehemiah provides a slightly more detailed response, although only slightly. It's a really simple process that Nehemiah and the builders go through. When the haters are hating, they go to God and they pray, and then they just get back to work. They keep on trotting their path and don't spend too much time thinking about or being detained by the attacks that are launched against them. In our story in Nehemiah chapter 4, we read about Sanballat, who really is just angry, and his anger is lashing out in mockery against the people of God. And Nehemiah goes to the Lord in prayer, as he so often does. Now, his prayer was a little bit challenging for us. It's in line with what are called the imprecatory Psalms. It's calling on God to judge, and the language is harsh and perhaps even violent. In some of these Psalms, it's very violent, actually. And we considered whether or not that's a model prayer for us, especially after we looked at the Lord's Prayer, where we were told to ask God to forgive as we've been forgiving other people. And that's a difficult thing to line these two things up. I think what's key is where we are in the history of God's redemptive mission is different from Nehemiah's place. We can learn from Nehemiah and the imprecatory Psalms to hand judgment over to God, and that's an essential thing to do. Nehemiah wasn't planning to take vengeance into his own hands, but he was trusting God to do that. But another thing that we need to take into consideration before we pray these kinds of prayers is what Paul says in the book of Ephesians, that our struggle, our battle, is not against flesh and blood. We're in a spiritual battle. And so when we pray that harsh, violent judgment would come, we don't pray that against our angry neighbors or coworkers or people in our family who may have wronged us in some way. We pray that against the enemies of the gospel. And those are ultimately understood to be spiritual enemies that we want to see judged. And so remember who your enemy is. We talked about that all the way back in the summer, Ephesians chapter 6. Encourage you to check that out and to adopt this mentality. When people do rise up against you, go to God in prayer. Pray that they'd be converted and become a part of God's kingdom, and then pray that the spiritual activity behind that attack would be dealt with and judged by God, who is all-powerful and in whom we can trust. And then let's get back to work. That's what we see here in verse 9 as well. We see that the people prayed to our God, and then they set up a guard, and they get back to work. So let's see people who focus on the mission and not be distracted by those who might be calling us out, might be slandering us. We live in a time when that's all too common. Public shaming on Facebook and social media happens all the time. But we're not going to let that be our focus. We're going to go to God, give it to Him, and get back to work. We invite you to come and join us as we continue our study of the book of Nehemiah next week, focusing on the second half of chapter 4.